All right, let's start with some background. So first off, what is phenology? To explain that, I'm showing you here three pictures that are showing the typical timing of a couple of biological events of interest that occur in the high mountain meadows of Mount Rainier. So shortly after snow melts in late June or July, the avalanche lily will bloom, and it's one of the first plant species to do so. So that's also around the time that pollinators, like the syrphid fly you see on this avalanche lily, emerge and start to pollinate. Of course, even more plant species like the mountain daisy that you see will flower in midsummer in late July or early August. And then finally, if you're hiking at Mount Rainier in late August or early September, you may be in fierce competition with blackberries for the huckleberries that are produced right around that time. So these bears are bulking up so that they can hibernate when snow comes again in October or November. So each of these events, flowering, pollination, fruit production, hibernation, represents a really important life event for the organism in question. And these events tend to occur at similar times seasonally every year. And that's because they tend to be cued by climate cues. So for Mount Rainier National Park, for example, and other Cascade Mountains, the timing of snowmelt likely controls the timing of a lot of the events pictured here. Now, the study of how and whether climate controls the seasonal timing of important life events like flowering, pollination, hibernation is called phenology. And flowering phenology is the process that we are studying in MeadoWatch. An important thing to recognize is that a lot of these phenological events are cued by climate. So one of the reasons ecologists like myself have become increasingly interested in studying and understanding phenology is because of its link to climate. So it's become increasingly clear that our planet is warming due to human activities, as pictured here in a graph from the IPCC report, which shows time year on the x-axis and temperature as a deviation from the mean on the y-axis. So you can see that up till about 2010, our global temperature had already risen by more than a degree in Fahrenheit. And you can also see that it's predicted to rise even more in the next century, depending on our carbon emissions. That's what these two different lines represent, is different scenarios for how much carbon we emit. So climate is also changing here in Washington. What you can see here with this map is the trend in snowpack in all climate stations in the Pacific Northwest. So each of the red or blue dots, circles, show the location of a climate station. And the red circles indicate declining trends in snowpack, while the blue dots indicate increases. The larger the circle, the larger the change. And I hope what you can see here is that almost all of these climate stations have seen declining snow. All right, so let's put these two pieces of information together. First, that phenology, so the timing of these important life events, is cued by climate. And second, that our climate is changing, and make a prediction for how phenology might be affected by climate change. So let's take these same three events, the flowering of avalanche lily and mountain daisy, the pollination of both of these species, the fruiting of huckleberry, and the eventual hibernation of black bears, and ask, what happens as climate warms in our region and snow melts earlier? So I think all of us would generally predict that as that occurs, as snow melts earlier, that all these events are likely to shift earlier in the growing season. So this can matter greatly for these organisms, for example, if they can't shift or if they shift too fast. But it can be especially important given that all of these organisms interact with other species, and their phenology might shift at different rates, which might influence the ways that they interact with these other species. Okay, so it's clear that this matters to the organisms. And that these phenological shifts, these changes in the timing of when these events occur, are a biological signal of climate change. But we also are interested, there's also a lot of us humans that are interested in trying to understand how phenology will shift with climate change. So as a scientist, as an ecologist, I find it really fascinating to think about how closely plants are in tune with their environment, matching the timing of their flowering and fruiting to a fairly narrow window of time in the summer when that's feasible. And knowing the mechanisms behind how this happens, is just something that I find really interesting. Similarly, trying to understand how changes in these phenological shifts can alter the network of interactions for these species is also incredibly intellectually interesting and a really sort of vibrant area of research within ecology. So members of the general public are of course also interested in knowing about flowering phenology, even if they don't know what that word means, because they want to know when to hike to see these iconic wildflowers at Mount Rainier National Park, and they're probably also interested in knowing how might this change in the future. A lot of visitors and volunteers we've interacted with have expressed to us their deep joy in connecting with their Washington landscapes during peak wildflower season. So this is something that is of great interest. And finally, Mount Rainier National Park is also really interested to know the patterns of how the flowering might change with warming, because that might influence how the timing of visitation to the park changes, since the majority of the visitors come to the park to view wildflowers in the summer. So these are all really good reasons to better understand the link between climate and flowering phenology, which is what the MeadoWatch program aims to do. So before we dive into MeadoWatch, I do want to spend a little bit of time telling you about the citizen science approach we are taking and why we are taking it. So it comes down to this. We have a problem in science, just like we unfortunately do in many other aspects of our lives. And that problem is well illustrated by the results of this Google search I recently did, where I just simply typed in famous scientists. And these are the images that come up. So these scientists are indeed all famous, and I think we can all agree that they have contributed a lot scientifically. But I think we can also agree that collectively they don't necessarily represent our society at large, neither in terms of their age, their gender, or their race. So science should be for everybody, and citizen science is one potential approach that can allow us to democratize science. So what is citizen science? So citizen science or community science involves volunteers, not scientists. I mean, scientists are involved, but it involves volunteers who aren't scientists in part of the scientific endeavor. So folks can help by collecting or processing scientific data, all in service of addressing a scientific question. And as such, a citizen science project offers a more inclusive way to do science by involving members of the general public, volunteers like yourselves. I should also say that in addition to that advantage, which is a really big one in my book, is that citizen science programs like MeadoWatch often also offer scientists a way to get just a much larger quantity of data or a larger time span of data than more traditional approaches.